my experience is very different, and the context that I'm coming from. I do research in Africa, and I've done research on refugees, primarily in Tanzania, and I've worked in a post-conflict situation in Burundi. And I have a book entitled Gender and Genocide in Burundi, and I'm currently writing one on refugees and citizenship and belonging in Tanzania. I, obviously, like most people doing research, I have completed ethics forms, and I never really, did everything that was required by my university, but never really thought about ethics until I suppose really talk about it in a very critical way until I had an experience in Burundi in 2006, and I visited a clinic because I was obviously interested in incidents of sexual violence, which wasn't as bad in Burundi as in other Liberia and other African conflict situations. And I visited this clinic to get some sense of the statistics that they had, the numbers of people or girls that were visiting the clinic. And the staff were very, very welcoming. And they saw me as an international outsider. And of course, I'm Black British, and I'm definitely an outsider. So they assumed, and I might be wrong, but my sense was they assumed there was a source of funding and they desperately needed funding. So they took me on a tour of the clinic. They gave me some statistics on the numbers of cases they treated and so on. And they took me to a room that was full of girls, obviously girls who had been abused. And they got one girl to recount her experience to me. And this girl was obviously traumatized. And I actually felt traumatized myself. I was nauseous. I wanted to throw up, and I didn't know how, And so in the end, actually, I couldn't listen to what she was saying because I was feeling so ill, and I wanted to get out of the situation very quickly. But I had to wait, obviously. Eventually, I left, and the whole experience really disturbed me, not just physically and psychologically, but also I started to think about the girl, obviously thinking about the girl and what she'd gone through, and realized that it was a clinic that was on the route for international actors, international researchers, policy advisors, visitors from abroad, the UN officers, the governmental representatives from different countries. It was on their sort of, route. And I just thought about all the girls, and probably that girl who'd gone through that experience again and again, right? And how, and there didn't seem to be much sort of psychological support in the clinic. So I started to think about ethics and started to look at one, I knew I wasn't trained to do that type of research, and I've never put myself in that situation again. But I started to look at the sort of method, read research reports of people who had conducted research on sexual violence in Africa. And I also read research reports and academic papers about people, on research on sexual violence that was conducted in North America and in Europe, primarily in North America. And I looked at the differences in how they were reported, and differences in terms of the methods and how the respondents or the survivors were treated in a different context. And I was ashamed and alarmed by this, right? There was very little discussion, there was very little academic rigor in Africa. And these are people who are collecting information to inform policy, but also academics. There's very little, the sorts of protocols that were put in place in doing research in the West were absent. And we might argue that's because it was a conflict situation, and therefore, and that's what people tend to ask. This is emergency, we need information. But I wondered is it really necessary to traumatize girls in order to be able to get information that they have been abused? Or is it necessary? Sometimes that research isn't necessary. We know what the situation is, we can assess, but then of course, as one of the researchers one of the reports I read, it was an academic paper in a very established medical journal in the West, said, we need quantitative data because numbers equals dollars. Right? And this was actually the researcher presenting her work to the American military, because this research was funded by the American military based in Germany, and she was presenting her work. I saw the presentation online and or extracts from it, and that's what she said. So it was about dollars rather than about individuals. So I did write a paper about this. It took a long time for me to get it published, obviously, because I was critical about it. Eventually, it went into a book. But so that, so again, so I suppose the question I want to pose here is, why is it that, and I think we probably know that in different contexts, we apply different research protocols and research standards. And is it ethical, therefore, to carry out particular forms of research in such contexts? And the second, another example of ethics that, and again, this relates to the work that I'm doing now. I was in the district in Western Tanzania in 2017, and there were a significant number. It's an area where refugees from Burundi fled genocide in Burundi in the 1970s settled. And since 2009, many of them have been given citizenship by the Tanzanian government, but they were still in these settlements, and some were still considered refugees because they hadn't actually got their citizenship certificate. So I was trying to, I went to actually introduce myself and to talk to local bureaucrats at the district and the regional level. But what I was surprised at, and I've done this before many times, but what I was surprised at was a level of hostility towards the refugees, or the former refugees. And one, official just refused to talk to me. He didn't want to see me because he was saying, yes, another research. I mean, I think the impression was another researcher coming to research these people. And this, and part of the reason why they were upset is the UNHCR has this comprehensive refugee response framework, which is to integrate refugees, really. How can we get rid of this group of people who we have had and had to support, even though the support has, declined significantly since the 80s, but nevertheless, they say, how do we, finally, take these people off our books? Let's do a study to look at how we can integrate them into the local community. Right. But of course, this study is problematic because the refugee population form the largest group within the community, and the Tanzania, or so you could say the old Tanzanians, feel aggrieved, right? That they might not have access to some of the resources that will go into these densely settled areas, and the fact that they're also aggrieved that resources have been pumped into these areas. And, this is an area which is relatively poor, which suffered under sort of neoliberalism, where, hospital services and so on, as you probably have imagined, incur user fees, and where conditions, the quality of the services is very poor. So there's a growing resentment, I felt, after going into that area for several years, towards the refugees. And this is amongst mainly government officials. And this led to, I think, considerable amount of foot dragging in terms of, helping to deliver the services, and also punitive measures exacted against individual and collectively, exacted individual and collectively to the refugee community. So that, where they can, they will sort of hold back wages. So refugee teachers were struggling to get their, the wages. And there was all sorts of things. And when I discussed this with the central government, they said, oh, well, that shouldn't be happening. There was a certain degree of ambivalence, but also recognition that, the refugees are a problem, and there's, we don't know what to do. We can do what the international community want in terms of making statements that would, support the integration of refugees. But, we're not on the ground. We are not the local and regional officials. So a consultancy report then, of course, was conducted to provide the evidence to support this policy solution. And in some ways, it partly implicated, because many, I don't include myself in this category, but many of us do consultancy research. And I think we sometimes, obviously we know the donors set the policy frameworks, we follow donor guidelines and so on as to the research, what we want to do, they want. But we don't necessarily see the implications of this. But academic research also can affect these communities negatively, even when we talk about solidarity and all the and the need to be sensitive to the vulnerability of these communities. And many of you will be familiar with Lisa Malky's book, Purity and Exile, in which she actually did research on the same community. She presented some very insightful observation of the relationship between refugee identity and the nation state. Yet, Malky depicted these Hutu refugees, who were victims of genocide, as essentially consumed by ethnic hatred and thirsty for revenge. And her generalization presented a single unified identity that drew on a master narrative, what she calls a mythical historical past of experience of violence against the group. And her depiction has helped shape interpretations of Hutus by scholars and policymakers within the region. And this depiction has informed, and I think can contribute to some adverse policies directed at the Hutu refugees, especially with regards to the lack of trust and assumptions about their motives and desires when, with respect to their wanting to stay in Tanzania. So one policy advisor I was talking to about, the citizenship, how we could encourage a sort of sense of belonging and amongst the refugees and so on. And she says, well, did you not read what Malky say? They want to return and overthrow the Burundi government. They don't want to stay here. Why should we, integrate these people, these violent people? Right? And I just thought, that research was done in the 80s. And it has traction. When we talk about research impact, we don't always understand how research and text can become part of the narrative of a people and then shape the responses of authorities. And what I found interviewing young Tanzanians, and this is something I've written about, but I'm extending in the book. Sorry, I meant the young refugees who have become Tanzanians. And many of them are desperate to hide their Hutu identity. And they shouldn't have to, because they're now citizens. They have their citizen certificate. And they hide their identity even in the context of when they get married. And in Tanzania, it's possible, Dar es Salaam especially. And the reason they'll say is that people think we are violent. These are people who suffered genocide. I mean, obviously, the Hutu, because of the genocide in Rwanda in 1994, Hutus generally, universally, are implicated. But it's this history, the histories of violence, continue in people's memory and then shape how Tanzanians see them. So Tanzania, anyway, I can develop that. All right. So I suppose I'm interested in the ethical responsibility of academics. And it tends to focus on fieldwork practices. We're aware, and I think more so now, even though, even after my story about the clinic, I think now there's much more sensitivity towards research in those contexts and toward vulnerable individuals. But we focus on getting informed consent. We talk about individuals. A sort of indigenous New Zealand scholar, Linda Tuhiwai-Simmet, talks about conventional research ethical practices as focusing on individual rights and the impacts on the individual, and seeing knowledge as individual property. But what happens in contexts that people do not imagine knowledge as individually owned, and impacts are more collective, right, and go beyond the refugee framework, right? So I think we have to think about how we go beyond research protocols when we think about ethics. And I want to give you some time to discuss. So I think power is central to that. The unequal power relations and how we address those in terms of our work. It would be, I suppose, power pervades, and again, this is something you're very familiar with. power relations and unequal power relations pervade the whole humanitarian exercise, and how the research process, and so on. But let me say something about power exhibited by the research, the expert, or where expert is derived from. And I'm troubled by this notion of the expert on conflict. And I think it's a colonial and a liberal manifestation, going back to your, a comment about this hierarchy of values. And the expert, it's envisioned, the expert as envisioned is an outsider. It's an international person normally. And that person is supposed to be neutral. If we think about peace contexts and so on, we need a neutral expert to negotiate. So I think it comes from that thinking about the neutrality of the outsider. Right? The expert is objective. And expert knowledge becomes technical knowledge that, as I said, that can be rationalized into numbers and subsequently monetarized. But it has the potential to dehumanize. Even when experts are sensitive to context, they can treat local people as objects of study, as data points, and that, I think, contribute to that dehumanization. But the expert is also not just local, international. They're also local experts. And again, I think we need to problematize and think about how we relate as, and presumably, some of us are local in this room, some are international, would be international in some contexts, but most of us are experts in some way or the other, are seen as experts, right? And the local expert is normally the key informant or the translator, the intermediary between the outsider expert and the ordinary people. But that intermediary, as we probably know, and as I've written about, is not necessarily local in many contexts, and is often of elite status, and therefore might convey those same ideas that we are challenging, and as the outsider experts. We are aware of the tensions between these different groups of experts, locally seen sometimes as having biases, and may facilitate corruption. Corruption comes when it, therefore, local experts are often seen as not being neutral in any way. So they might themselves become objectified and depicted as people lacking compassion. So I want us to think about, who constitutes the experts, and where should ethical responsibility lie, and how we might be able to work together in, international, or people who are interested in issues of solidarity, how we might work together with communities. And I think Elena asked me to comment here because I am interested in thinking through how we might decolonize migration studies. And I'm not going to define decoloniality, but I think one of the things I think it's really difficult to do research on migration and refugees in Africa without recognizing the coloniality of the experience, the process, the people, the way people are ranked, and so on, the ordering of human beings. But also the dominance of the nation state in our approach to research and our scale of analysis. And I suppose for a decolonial approach, I would advocate a sort of feminist intersectional approach to research, looking at those intersecting layers of oppression that make finding humane solution to refugee situations difficult. And I want to just mention racialization, because it tends not to feature sometimes when we talk about ethics. More and more researchers, and I am pleased to see, are using race as a factor in their analysis of migration and of refugees. And just because I'm working in the African context, it doesn't mean that race doesn't matter. It's quite significant in terms of who is seen as the custodian of humanity, as the Barbadian writer George Lamin uses the term. Westerners perceive themselves as to be guardians and custodians of human destiny, not a branch of the human family. And so since the 1980s, through the period of NGOization and the rise of humanitarianism, the Westerner, the outsider, the white expert especially, is seen both by the I would say the wider international community, but also by some Africans themselves as a solution to their problem. I think there's enough evidence to suggest that that's not going to happen. They're not going to provide a solution. The solution has to come from internally or through people working together. But I think we have to address race and its importance, how it exists in these oppressive relationships, in order to be able to reach a position where we can talk about working together to find a solution for all. And one of the notes I have here also is about looking at the decentering the nation state. And I'm aware of all the sociological literature around this in regards to the nation state in political and social analysis. But I think in the refugee context, and certainly in Africa, there's a lot of research focused on state-directed or multinational, multinational in the sense that they're either UN-focused, they're sponsored by states, and this has problems for how we approach our relationship with the local state, but how we approach the refugees as a community. Right? So states tend to emphasize, and Tanzania, for example, emphasizes policing and security above well-being. Right? So resources are often targeted, and as part of the comprehensive refugee response framework, one of the first things they did was to build more police stations. Right? So how do we move, I think thinking about how we move beyond these state-centered, donor-centered research priorities is really important in order to decenter the state from refugees, and I can pick up on those. And it might mean that we have to think about the scale of analysis, and I'm particularly interested in, as a geographer, I suppose I can do all sorts of things, so without much criticism. So I tend to do multi-scalar research, which anthropologists might not see as rigorous enough, but I think it provides the explanations and that I would like. So, but I think in the context, say, of Western Tanzania, should we be looking at studying individual refugees? Should we be looking at, at state provisioning or provisioning of service? Shouldn't we be talking to communities? Shouldn't we be talking to families? Shouldn't we think about other ways or other ways of doing research? Thinking about asylum differently, engaging, for example, with practices of conviviality. And this is where it links to the work on religion, because one of the things about in the communities, one of the refugee settlements in that part of Tanzania has the largest church in Eastern and Southern Africa. And the building is huge. And they built it, and they have visitors from all over. And they move across Tanzania, ministers and preachers, they go, and it's a Pentecostal church, but nevertheless it's quite significant in terms of promoting conviviality. It's something that I didn't focus on, but yes, it does, I think that there is a need for research there. Okay, I think I'm going to stop. Ethically responsible scholarship obviously necessitates a more critical examination of our positioning of the identities, the way in which we do research, the language we use, the categories we investigated, the assumptions that we've drawn. And it doesn't matter, I think, the context you're in, whether you're in policy work, academic work, or activism. The research you do matters, even if it doesn't have immediate implications. Okay, thank you.